What's up, horror fans? It is Danny from the Lasercast, joined as always by Pete, and we've been looking forward to this one for a while now. We are going to dive deep. Whew, English is hard. Into In Search of Darkness Part 3, which you guys can watch now on Shudder. And hey, the Super Bowl or the Superb Owl starts at around 6:30 tonight. So when you're done watching, you can go watch In Search of Darkness 3, and that'll take you right into the big game. So there you go.
Whoa.
Good way to occupy yourself on a Sunday. If you are not familiar with our channel, Pete and I have interviewed director David Weiner several times. He is a friend of the channel. We had him on to talk about In Search of Darkness Part 1, Part 2, In Search of Tomorrow, which is a 4+ hour 80s science fiction documentary. And we had him on to preview this documentary. And Pete, we were just talking before we started recording and before I started flubbing lines in English that this might be our favorite of the 3 In Search of Darkness documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you put this in your ranking of the 3 documentaries, and why?
Yeah, I'd say it's my favorite because in the first one, I did recognize a lot of the movies, even though I hadn't seen all of them. In this one, I got a little worried at first. I was like, oh shit, do I know any of these movies? Have I seen any of these movies? And eventually when we got to about 1986, then I was like, oh, okay, I've seen this one. But it's really obscure right up front. And besides that, I really like the talking heads in this movie. They kind of have leftover content from previous interviews from the past 2 movies. But in this one, you have a couple of new talking heads.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really liked what they brought to the table. What about you, man?
Yeah, I 100% agree. Of the 2 of us, I am we always like to say I'm the horror guy, you're the sci-fi guy, even though we both like the other genre.
Correct.
And I feel like I have seen a lot of horror movies in my life. And so it blew me away how deep the deep cuts were in this one, how obscure the movies were. I wrote down literally, I took pages of notes. And I took down every year by year. I wrote down every movie covered, and I was circling the ones that I've seen. And it's like 1980, only 2 movies. 1981, only 1 movie. 1982, only 2 movies. It's not until like 83, 84 where I start to get, a little more circles. Mm-hmm. And that was the thrilling part for me. I feel like, and we've brought this up with David when we've talked to him, that these documentaries become almost like fun homework assignments for horror fans, where it's like, all right, let me make a list of all the ones that I haven't seen, and now it's time to play catch up. And that's really one of the main things that we're going to be doing today is we're going to be giving each other a list of about 4 or 5 movies that we'd like to eventually cover on this channel and that were brought up in the documentary.
Yes.
As always, not only does he go through the years, but he also does chapter breakdowns. For every break between the years in the 1980s, there's a chapter breakdown. Some of them go into issues in the 80s. Some of them are focuses on specific people from the 80s, whether it's Adrienne Barbeau, Dee Wallace, Screamin' Mad George, or just an overview of like the classic horror directors of the 80s.
Yeah.
This was one of the easiest 5.5 hours I've ever spent watching anything.
Yes.
And I'm so glad that we could be part of the Kickstarter campaign for it. And, seeing your name in the credits is really cool. And the Lasercast is actually in the credits in there.
Yes.
So it was that was really cool. But yeah, of the 3, I think this is definitely my favorite because, like you said, and David's a smart director. When you're making In Search of Darkness, a journey into 80s horror, you got to hit all the big titles. You got to hit your your franchises, your Nightmare on Elm Street, your Friday the 13th, your Halloweens. You got to hit those sequels. You got to hit the movies that everybody knows. And occasionally you could throw in a few weirder ones. Part two got a little bit deeper, started to involve more foreign horror from the 80s. And then this one is just like everything that is left on the shelves. And, you made a good point. You brought up about, before we started talking, before we started recording, you mentioned how the way the technology changed in the early 80s really impacted 80s horror. And that this documentary puts a lot of emphasis on that.
Yes. That is one of the best sequences that's not just a straight up review of a movie. That was a great thing because when we've talked to David, we've talked about how it's like, okay, well, we've already established these very well-known movies, these franchises, and now we're going to get more and more obscure. And once you get to film 3, you kind of run this risk of, okay, well, I'm going to start talking about movies that nobody really knows about. Maybe they're not even that good, right? But the way that David frames it is so smart because he essentially explains why these weird random movies came about. Like the very beginning of the movie is about how the videotape industry began and what it looked like, how videotapes are super expensive at first and it was like a novelty, and then they needed these tapes in order to make a profit, and so they started to greenlight all of these weird movies, not to mention that people really liked obscure weird shit, and so all of a sudden you got these green lights for all these movies that you just wouldn't normally see, and so that
also led to people with the VHS explosion and with the idea that you can make a movie on film, that it basically allowed anyone to make a movie. Anyone who owned a video, one of those big ass, on your shoulders, like grandpa at the holidays, video camcorders, could now effectively make a super cheap movie. And like we see some of those later on. Like anyone here who's ever watched Joe Bob Briggs, they made us watch Things from 1989, and they talk about how that is probably the worst movie ever made, but it was made for dirt cheap, and it was made on video and thrown into a video store. I think it's Joe Bob who has the quote, "Movies became products," in the early, and that's in that section you're talking about, VHS explosion, and that really, like, and we've talked about this with David several times, that my love, especially for horror as a genre, came from going to the video store as a kid. I'm born in 82. And so as early as I can remember, 85, 86, 87, I remember spending, like, my dad would take me to the video store and he would give me 20, 30 minutes to walk around. And when I wasn't renting like He-Man episodes on VHS, I was in the horror section and I was looking at, movie boxes that I should not have been looking at. And I was fascinated. And some of those movies were these, like, just me. And I remember also, like, the signs that were up, like, if you don't return, like, fee for broken video cassettes was like $99. And I remember thinking, like, how could this be so expensive?
Yeah.
Especially when just a few years after that, not a few years, maybe a decade later in the late 90s, when the DVD explosion started. And I remember being able to buy DVDs for like $14.99, $19.99 at, Suncoast Video. Or Saturday Matinee in the Staten Island Mall, right? And I remember thinking, like, these are better quality than videos, but they're so much cheaper. And it's really amazing how the technology's changed. Like, I had a huge VHS collection, then I had a huge DVD collection. Now I have a big Blu-ray and DVD and everything collection. So.
Yeah, it's funny. Parents were really spoiled back then, right? Because just going to the video store, looking around the video store could take up a whole hour. Now when we go to show our kids something, it's like they can immediately watch what they want to see, right? But I totally agree. And they talk about it in the beginning of the movie too, how like the video store experience is so essential. And it's funny because I know that we're just small potatoes to David, and he's interviewed so many people. But every so often, I'll watch something in this movie and be like, "Did he kind of put that in there because like we talked about it?" I mean, I'm guessing probably not. But like at the very end of the movie, did you notice that fucking Unmasked 25 was in the fucking movie?
It was.
Yes.
So it's funny you brought that up. There's two things that I noticed.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, I know the other one too.
yeah,
Superman 3, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, a couple of things. I've been trying to every time we talk to David, especially with this movie, because this movie was like so deep cut that he was having people send in suggestions
Right.
for what would be in it. So of course I sent in Unmasked Part 25.
Yep.
Valentine's Day is coming up. I'm going to be rewatching it again. It's like my annual tradition. I'll probably throw up another video on the channel next week.
Nice.
But Unmasked Part 25 is a movie that I remember seeing the VHS for in 1988, 89 when it came out. I was 6 or 7 years old. And I remember thinking even back then, oh my God, this looks like a Friday the 13th ripoff because he's
Right.
wearing like a different version of a hockey mask. I finally saw the movie a few years ago. It was streaming free on Tubi. I don't know if it is. If it is, you should all go search for it. But in the last little section, famous last words, there is a scene from Unmasked Part 25, and I legit did one of these. Like, yes!
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I was so excited to see that. And then, of course, there's another great chapter later in the film. And by later in the film, I mean like 4 hours and 40 minutes into the film,
Yeah.
which I thought was also brilliant about how it's called In Any Genre, Horror Lurks.
Right.
And I
right.
and I love that because some of the scariest things that happened to me in the 80s had nothing to do with horror movies.
Right.
Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen.
Right.
Young Sherlock Holmes is one of the scariest movies I ever saw as a kid.
Right.
And of course, the scene in Superman 3 where the woman becomes a robot at the end, which we have talked about with David, both in the In Search of Tomorrow conversations and In Search of Darkness conversations. So were those things thrown in just for, the Lasser cast? I don't know. I am going to hold on to Unmasked Part 25, though, because I'm pretty sure it's me and about 9 other people on Earth who love this movie.
Yes. Really good point. It's just cool watching a movie that of like someone that we've talked to multiple times. We get to see the motors running and like we know, oh, this is what he was thinking about when he made this part. And so as we go through the collection of the movies that we want to start talking about, I was thinking about like, well, why did David pick this specific movie? Right now, I picked 4 movies, right? Because we already covered Possession, which is we did that last week. It's all of our videos that are going to come out are going to say In Search of Darkness 3, Spotlight, and then the movie. And so you guys at home, we're going to like be David right now and flip it to you. If you guys have some recommendations besides what me and Danny say, please tell us because we love the interaction with you guys. And especially if you guys know where we can find these movies because some of them are so obscure that it's even hard to find them on streaming. Like, wasn't there one day that you couldn't even find on streaming?
I actually bought Mystics in Bali. It's coming from Amazon. It should be arriving tomorrow.
Nice.
I actually ordered it on I don't even know, DVD, Blu-ray, because I this is not the first time I've ever heard of Mystics in Bali, and I saw parts of it and I was just like, I need to see that movie. So I looked up a lot of these movies on like my Roku where it says like search and it tells you like which streaming channel they're on. And some of them are just nowhere.
Right.
Like these are the deepest deep cuts. Like, and that's one of the things where going back to the whole VHS thing, a lot of these movies, as we move away from physical media, if you don't have, and that's why some of these companies are so important. And I wish I had more money to support all of them. Like, what is it? Severin Films, Shout Factory, Vinegar Syndrome.
Vinegar Syndrome, yeah.
Yeah. If I wish I had more money to support these companies because they are the ones that are taking these super obscure movies and finding them, putting them onto physical media, That's why I own a special edition Blu-ray of Unmasked Part 25 because of
Yeah.
Vinegar Syndrome.
Yeah.
So it's if you don't have a company like that who's handling the physical media and it doesn't get picked up by one of these large streaming services, you're kind of shit out of luck with some of these older movies.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that I can find all the movies that I listed on here on streaming, and if worst case scenario, I can buy one too. It's funny though. Before I made this list, there are movies that like I remember kind of seeing as a kid. I didn't necessarily see the whole thing because it was just like on TV, and I would see like the beginning or the middle or something like that. But they always had this kind of distinct impression, and maybe I didn't remember the title back then. But then seeing this documentary, I'm like, oh shit, that's that movie. And with this particular documentary, I feel like there's the most overlap between The Last Drive-In and In Search of Darkness. Like Joe Bob's in it, Darcy's in it for a very short time, but a few of the movies on this list, I'm like, oh, I know about this because it was on The Last Drive-In.
Yeah.
Too, you know. So like some just quick honorable mentions before I go into my movies, but I remember seeing Transylvania 65000 when I was a kid and be like, oh, this is fun. This is like a horror thing, but it's fun. Deadly Friend. How can you forget the fucking moment when
basketball?
Exactly. Yeah, I was at my mom's apartment watching In Search of Darkness, and I'm like, I know exactly what they're going to show for this movie, right? And then here's an example of what I was just talking about a moment ago. Terror Vision. I remember seeing it as a kid, late night on TV, and being like, what the fuck am I watching? And then it's like, oh, okay, it's this movie, Terror Vision. So I'm assuming that you saw all three of these.
I saw Terror Vision. I really enjoy it. I think it's funny because I think it's very obvious that it was supposed to be a serious horror movie that they kind of gave up on midway through and decided, no, we're going to go the comedy route.
Yeah.
What was the other way?
So Transylvania 65000.
I remember the video box for it. I remember Jeff Goldblum and who is it, Ed Begley Jr.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever saw that.
Yeah.
I did see Saturday the 14th that they brought up as like a companion piece to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally forgot, or maybe I didn't even realize it, but Michael Richards is in it, right? And I've been watching a lot of Seinfeld recently with my daughter and my wife, so like, oh, I got to see this again. And then they quick cut to like Gina Davis as a vampire, kind of like in a sexy outfit. I'm like, I got to watch that soon. Yeah.
I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna take a guess because I know you, and that one of your movies, and maybe I'm jumping ahead on your list, but I know how much you love folk horror. So Eyes of Fire has to be on your list.
That's my number one, man. You did the money shot already. Yes, of course. I mean, did you see that movie?
So that movie was on Shudder last year. They did a big folk horror thing last year. In fact, Woodlands Dark, this like 3-hour folk horror documentary that I still have not sat down and watched, is still on Shudder. And Eyes of Fire was in their folk horror collection, and I didn't get a chance to watch it, but holy shit, just looking at some of the scenes and the imagery from it, definitely want to check that out. So if that's on your list, that I'm totally cool with finding that and checking that movie out, because I know you've said many times your favorite horror movie of all time is The Wicker Man. It is one of my probably top 10 favorite horror movies of all time. We're talking about the original here, not Nicolas Cage. Love him, but sorry. But yeah, I mean, that Eyes of Fire is definitely a movie, and I thought it was interesting. That was the movie that they said the director made it, and then like apparently never made another horror movie. And I'm like, this movie looks amazing. Like, how could he have like not made another movie?
Exactly. It looks so good. The cinematography looks so good for that movie. It looks like something totally different and removed. Like, I haven't even seen anything like it. I'm super excited about that one. Phil Noble Jr., the editor-in-chief of Fangoria, is throughout this whole documentary. He's one of the most consistent talking heads throughout the whole movie. And he talks about folk horror and how it had a big explosion in cinema in Britain in like the 60s and 70s. And that's where we get The Wicker Man, right? But it's interesting because he says that it's not common to see American folk horror. Yet when you read the synopsis of this movie or hear what they describe in Search of Darkness, doesn't it sound like The Witch? It sounds just like The Witch, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because you would think with like Native American history that there'd be so much to explore in terms of like folk horror here with like the pilgrims and all the weird religion that came over in like the 1600s and Native Americans and like we're always cool to throw in like a Native American curse or like a graveyard.
Yeah.
So it feels like there's a lot of room there. And like I guess Eggers with like The Witch and even The Lighthouse is like the best modern example. Even Ari Aster, Midsummer, like these are like I guess updated versions of folk horror that we're seeing. So maybe it's on the comeback. Who knows?
Maybe, man. I mean, obviously, I bet you David Eggers has seen this movie and is
Robert
inspired.
Eggers.
Oh my God, Robert Eggers.
No, it's okay. David Weiner, Robert Eggers.
Oh man. Well, anyway, speaking of Native American stuff, I just want to do a little shout out too. I just met Stephen Graham Jones last night at the Highball in Austin. That's why I'm actually wearing my Dark Tower shirt today, because he was on the King Cast, and it was real cool. I met the two guys that run the King Cast.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I'm hoping for those of you guys that like my interviews and stuff with horror authors. Stephen Graham Jones is a pretty big name. He did My Heart Is a Chainsaw. He has a new book out called Don't Fear the Reaper. I'm going to reach out to his publicist. He gave me your email, and I'm going to see if I can get it on the show, too.
Yeah, I have My Heart Is a Chainsaw in my Audible. So the weather here in New York suddenly is beautiful. It's going to be like 60s all week. My dream of a snow-free winter is happening. And so I can get back out, running a little bit and listening to books on Audible again. So I'll definitely get to that.
Yeah, man. So we've covered. So okay, we were supposed to come up with 5 movies each, and I let one of my choices be Possession, which we already covered, and then you jumped ahead and got my Eyes of Fire. So let's do your number 5 then. What are you interested in watching?
So I've been trying to watch this movie for I feel like my entire life because ever since the video store closed, I haven't seen it. It's not streaming, and they actually make a point about how there's like stuff going on behind the scenes that's preventing this movie from being seen, and it's Trick or Treat. It's 1986, I believe.
Yeah.
You have Ozzy Osbourne playing a Christian fundamentalist in it, which is the best casting of anything of that nature. I feel like when Kevin Smith cast George Carlin as like the religious zealot in Dogma, that was like perfect, like on the nose casting in this vein.
Right.
You have Gene Simmons in this movie, and it's all about a rock star who is killed in a fire and comes back to life, or not comes back to life, but it's that typical satanic panic of you play the record backwards and the devil or the demon comes out. But I've been trying to find this movie it's got to be close to 30 years now. And I would love to get my hands on a physical copy of it, any copy of it, and finally give that a watch and talk about it. Because I feel like just the sub-genre of rock and roll horror is permeated throughout this documentary.
Absolutely.
He talks, the second segment is about satanic panic.
Mm-hmm.
And, you had the blending of heavy metal music and horror movies have always been connected.
Right.
I teach about, Dee Snider and Twisted Sister, and Dee Snider showing up to Congress and, talking about his music videos and the song "We're Not Gonna Take It," and they in Trick or Treat, there's effectively like the musician who dies in the fire and then comes back. There's a scene where he goes to Congress, and I think while I was watching this documentary, I think I started watching it right after the Grammys. And I don't watch the Grammys, but all I saw on Twitter was like this legit satanic panic from the far right
Yeah.
about, of all
Sam
the
Smith.
people on earth, Sam Smith.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you saw the same thing a few years, like last year, maybe. Was it like Little Nas X did a music video involving the devil?
Right.
And he's, of course, very flamboyant. And, you know, a lot of things that he does trigger the far religious right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, there are politicians in the government right now on Twitter talking about how, like, this is what the left wants. They want Satan to take over. And I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, here we are. You know,
Yeah.
yesterday I was in the movie theater and I saw the preview for the new Dungeons and Dragons movie, which doesn't actually look like Dungeons and Dragons, but it looks like it'll be fun. And I'm just like, I wonder if there's going to be people protesting that. And you know, we saw this with Stranger Things in the last season of Stranger Things, how there was the Satanic Panic involved and the Hellfire Club and all these things. And like, I feel like it just that section of the video felt so current. And,
yes.
you know, seeing Sammy Kerr, this fictional rock star in Trick or Treat, go and pull a D. Snyder and go to Congress to testify against the PMRC is incredible. So if we ever get a chance, I'd love to cover Trick or Treat.
I absolutely would love to cover this movie. And dude, you're knocking my list out. That was my number 2. Was Trick or Treat from 1986. The thing is, right, David gave us a sample of In Search of Darkness 3 before he came on the last time. And so this segment was part of that, sample he gave us. And I was super excited because I love Dungeons and Dragons. I love metal music. It all kind of comes together with horror and this. And so I knew I had to see this movie. There's another channel, which I wear their shirt and stuff sometimes. It's, Red Letter Media. They have Half in the Bag and they have Best of the Worst. I believe they covered Trick or Treat 1986 on Best of the Worst. That's the first time I ever saw anything about it. And it just looked like it was so much fun. I think David was pretty proud that he got to get Gene Simmons on In Search of Darkness 3. And so, he's in this too, talking about it a little bit. I agree with every single thing you said, but it's just cool that they took the time to focus on this part of our culture, which I really do feel like is so much of a part of my identity, is like Dungeons and Dragons, metal, horror. There's like a whole crew. We all kind of go together. Yeah. And one of my favorite talking heads on this movie was David. I always fuck up his last name, but
Malkian.
That's Malkian. Thank you so much. From like Blade Runner 2049, The Dark Knight, and so many other fucking.
He hosted the Fangoria Chainsaw Awards also.
Yeah, I mean, he's an awesome
on
dude.
Shudder.
Yeah, and like I just mentioned the King Cast. I thought he was a really great guest when he was on the King Cast. He brings up some really great points throughout this whole documentary, but in that particular sequence, he really shines, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Another movie, if I'm just gonna go with another movie off my list,
okay,
that I think is also incredibly topical. For movie came out in, when did it come out? 83, I think.
Okay.
Curtains.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure, yeah.
There are very few movies that I've advocated we should remake these movies.
Right.
My number one all time is Shocker. I just think Shocker would work so much better today with modern technology, with streaming, with the internet.
Absolutely.
And bring Mitch Pileggi back. He can still be Horace Pinker. All good.
Right.
But Curtains is another one. I saw Curtains and I really, really enjoy Curtains. It's a movie that has some really great scenes. Like the hag mask in that movie is such a unique mask. And the weapon also, it's like there's that scene where like the villain is ice skating after the girl with like these scythes and the hag mask on, and it's something like you've never seen anything like that before.
Yes.
But the basic plot of this movie is a pervy director takes a bunch of women off to like this resort where he's basically saying, we're going to see who's the best for this role. And he basically goes around sleeping with all of them and harassing them and molesting them, and all the while there's a killer there. And he starts the movie by taking this older actress and going, "Oh, you need to learn how to be crazy, so I'm going to put you in an institution," and then he just leaves her there. And like in the post Harvey Weinstein world, I feel like this is a movie that really needs to be revisited, and I think a remake of it could be really effective. Now it runs the risk of people screaming, "Oh, it's woke, it's woke, it's woke," but it also, like, we know that shit like this has happened. So I think it would be really effective if it came out. And if you haven't, if they don't want to remake it, just seeing the original, it's really good. I think it is streaming a few different places. And if not, I think you can like rent it or buy it on Amazon.
Yeah.
This one
What?
isn't as hard to find as Trick or Treat.
So, wasn't there a movie that came out this year that was about the Weinstein thing, but it's a drama? Um,
Oh, that was She Said,
right. Carrie
which,
Mulligan's in it, and like,
so
yeah,
basically that movie is like, remember Spotlight won Best
yes,
Picture?
yes.
That movie is basically Spotlight, except instead of the church's abuse, it's about the Weinstein situation. It's like literally about the two women who exposed the Harvey Weinstein story.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, with Carrie Mulligan. So I mean, like, obviously, like, this is very topical, like you said. I do remember that. The funny thing about watching a 5 hour and a half plus movie is that there's so much going on. You see so much, and there's so many quick images. But I do distinctly remember that hag mask. So I'm definitely down. I'm on board for watching this one if we want to find it streaming. So we've covered two of yours, right, and two of mine. Let's pop on over to my this one I'd say I'm the least excited about out of all of them, but it was one of the very first movies that they covered, and it is The Boogeyman, 1980. So, have you ever seen this one?
I have not. And from the movie, what they showed of it looks very strange. It looks like it's
Right.
less about the boogeyman and more about this, like, a ghost of the guy a woman is sleeping with. Very,
Yeah.
very strange.
So one thing that you see, because you see patterns in these interviews too, in Search of Darkness, and one of the patterns that you see is that in multiple 80s movies, they just kind of stick elements from other movies into a movie. Like they just take weird elements. Like a lot of times they would take stuff from like Aliens and Terminator and stuff and put it all into one movie, right? Or in this case, they would take stuff from like Halloween. Like they have sort of like Michael Myers' origin in the beginning of this movie, and then they have weird, possession stuff in this movie too. So it has a beginning that's very similar to the beginning of the original Halloween, where there's a boy and a girl, and their mom has a new boyfriend. He does something to kind of upset the son, and then the son comes and just stabs the guy to death. And I think that guy is the boogeyman. And he wears like a stocking over his face. So you have this kind of weird image throughout of this guy with a stocking on his face. One of the cool shots I saw when they were going through the description is like there's like a piece of a mirror, and it like flips and it like lands on the girl's eye, but not like inner eye like you'd expect in a horror movie, but like over it to give her almost like she looks like almost like Cable from the X-Men or the X-Force.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was really intriguing. The reason why the mirror piece is in there is because I think the guy's like trapped in a mirror too in this.
Yeah.
It's like shattered. Yeah. So the movie itself doesn't look like it would necessarily be like a fun, good time, or be like, oh, this looks like a really well-made movie like Eyes of Fire. But it just looked kind of weird and interesting. And it was the first movie that caught my attention in the documentary.
Yeah. It was actually it was the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was the 6th movie talked about.
Oh, there you
I
go.
wrote
Okay.
them all down.
Nice. All right. Well, I've knocked out 3 of my 5. You want to hit up another one of yours?
Yeah, I'll go with a movie that I saw at an all-night horror film not festival. It was like out in Long Island. They did this movie theater did a horror movie. I don't know, all nighter where you paid like one ticket price and you just sat in the movie theater literally from like 10 o'clock at night until 9 o'clock the next morning.
Whoa.
And they just played like 7 or 8 horror movies. So the first time I saw this movie, the only time I saw this movie was about 2:30 in the morning.
Huh.
And I thought that I had fallen asleep and dreamed half of this movie because none of it made sense. And it turned out I didn't. I stayed awake for all of freaking Extra. Extra is one of the weirdest freaking movies that anyone has ever seen.
Yes.
They had the director.
Yes.
And I was laughing so hard at the director talk about Extra because he was like, yeah, I don't really know what we were doing. He's like, I've had people tell me that this is what the movie's about. They're wrong. I have no. He's like, I made it. I don't even have a clue. And it's like there's an alien kidnapping. Then there's this like monster that fornicates with a woman, and a woman gives birth to a 40-year-old man. Then in the middle of that, you have this kid whose toys are alive, and there's midget clowns running around, and you're like, what the fuck is going on? Yes. And like I truly like, I remember like it was 4 o'clock in the morning. It was now time for the next movie to start. And I'm like, I looked at the person next to me. I'm like, was there a clown in that movie or did I fall asleep? And he's like, no, there was a clown. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Was there, did a woman give birth to an adult man? He's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, I guess I stayed awake and I'm just getting to the point of the night where I'm delirious now. And movies today, you're not going to find a movie that is just this balls to the wall insane. Where it's like you said with the Boogeyman, it's just like, I'm going to splice in different parts of different genres into this one movie and nothing really makes sense. And we're not going to explain any of it. And anything that you come up with in your mind as an explanation, that's it, because I have nothing. Yeah. And that's really Extra. And I appreciate a movie like that. I also appreciate that I think the director mentioned that this movie, like, for its opening week, pushed E.T. off the number one, at least awesome. For the first week.
Right.
So,
yeah,
he holds on to that.
I am really glad this is one of your choices because honestly, this could easily have been one of my choices as well. It didn't make my top 5, but I was very intrigued by it. There's one sequence that they focus on in the documentary where there's a creature that moves around in a strange way, this alien creature, not this big gray alien that you see throughout the movie, but this creature.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's like, yeah. They've actually, that image has actually been repurposed for like modern YouTubers and like meme makers who are like, what would you do if you saw this in the middle of the night? And they just show a scene from Extra and you're like, you think it's like this creepy pasta thing that has just been invented, but no, it's from an obscure, bizarre 80s horror movie that like 75 people in the world have seen.
Right.
And it's this like alien who's like walking on all fours, but almost upside down. Right. So it like, imagine if you laid back on all four of with your stomach to the ceiling and then tried to turn your head back. It's at our age, we would probably get hurt and have to go to the hospital.
Well, the thing is, right, is that we could do a little thing like the movie, the documentary right now, and have a little in-between segment between our movies. They talk about practical effects quite a bit in this documentary. And I think that's why these things, there's obviously this nostalgia, right? We have In Search of Darkness 3 movies in now, and it's all about the 80s. Like, obviously, there's something about the 80s that people keep wanting to go back to. And I think the reason why we're haunted by so much of this stuff is because of the practical effects. And whether they're good or not, they still leave an impression on us. Now, one sequence in this In Search of Darkness 3 that's so great is when they show Screaming Mad George, and he kind of talks about his filmography. Yeah. Now, I I always know about the special effects people that you hear about all the time, right? Like Stan Winston, Phil Baker, right? I actually was not familiar with Screaming Mad George. I've seen a lot of his movies that like his work is in, like Big Trouble in Little China or like Nightmare on Elm Street,
The cockroach scene,
the
yeah.
cockroach scene. I mean, I will always fucking remember that sequence, and it's just cool that it's this one guy and that he came from another country where the practical effects were so crazy too. So that in a way kind of touched upon two segments that are so great in Search of Darkness. There's a segment just about him, and then there's a whole segment about Asian horror. And I'm sure that probably tickled your pickle when you were watching that part, right?
Yeah. I mean, we can't leave off his what's the French expression? Piece de resistance, society.
Oh yeah.
The whole shunting scene in Society is just Screaming Mad George at his glorious, debaucherous best. But yeah, the Asian horror sequence, I really enjoyed that because it's really a blind spot for me when it comes to horror. Um, and like I said, like Mystics in Bali is a movie I went out of my way to buy. A movie I was dying to find on streaming that I couldn't find that I might have to buy. Devil's Fetus from 1983. 1983 was a big year. It had Curtains, Extra, Possession. No,
Yes.
Possession was really
81.
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe it came out in America in '83 because I
Oh,
wrote it.
okay.
But Devil's Fetus and Eyes of Fire all came out in '83.
Yeah.
But yeah, Devil's Fetus, man, that movie looks insane. Yeah, no, there was a movie. I have this book somewhere up on my thing on my bookshelf called like the 100 horror movies you have to see before you die.
Sure.
And one of them is from the 80s. It's called The Chinese Horror Story. And it was streaming on Amazon, but they didn't have it with subtitles. So I couldn't watch it because I don't speak Chinese. So
Yeah.
I wrote them on Twitter. I was like, you have this movie, foreign film on Amazon with no subtitles. What are you doing? But I'd love to get deeper into Asian horror because really in our lifetime, it's almost as if Asian horror doesn't exist until late high school, early college, and you start to see the rise of J horror. Yeah, right. The Ring, The Grudge, and then all the movies that are very similar to that all came out around that same time period. What is that, like 99 to 2000?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I saw, and I hated at the time, the American version of The Ring came out while I was in college because my friends came up to college to visit me, and we all went and saw The Ring. And everybody else was in the theater going, ah! And we were laughing hysterically because we hated it.
Yeah.
But the Ringu came out, I think, in 99. The Grudge, same director, I think also came out that year. Or different director, but he remade his own movie in America with Sarah Michelle Gellar, which was weird. But all those movies, that was Asian horror. And some of the best horror movies that have come out in the last decade have been Asian horror movies. Train to Busan, probably the best zombie movie I've ever seen in my life. Not to spoil our top 10 for those of you who haven't watched the video, you put up numbers 10 through 6 already, but one of your movies was Incantation. Another movie, Impetigore, was on my list from a few years ago. We're talking Indonesia, South Korea, obviously Japan. So like China kind of gets left out, and that was a focus of that section.
Yeah.
Before we get to our like final picks, I also just want to mention, I want to kind of blend two more of the sections that were there.
Sure.
He does a section on like the great horror directors of the 80s.
Yes.
And obviously when you're talking about the 80s, you have John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Romero, Dante, Argento. These guys aren't putting out like a new horror movie every couple of years. They're putting out a new movie every year. Like Carpenter is on this like mad run from 1981 until 1988, where I believe in an 8-year period, he puts out 7 movies.
Oh my God.
Argento is very similar. He and like a lot of times we'll look at Halloween with Carpenter and Suspiria with Argento, which came out in the late 70s. But then all of a sudden you go with Carpenter, especially, it's like The Fog, The Thing, Escape from New York, Starman, which isn't a horror movie, but it's science fiction.
Right.
Christine, They Live, Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness. I mean, I think it's actually 8 movies in 9 years. I don't even know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you got Craven, you got David Cronenberg, and I wanted to kind of blend that with, these are the directors that we always talk about, like Mount Rushmore style of horror, especially for our lifetimes. But then there's a great section towards the end on diversity and marginalization in the 80s. And they talk about how, all the stereotypes that existed in the 80s. Things like, the Chinese friend who was like very, had the very phony Asian accent. They had, I just actually bought, I wish I didn't have it in my bag. I bought a book from Barnes and Noble, which is written by the people who are behind horror noir, called The Black Guy Dies First. And it's about all the tropes that have existed in black horror. And you saw that a lot in the 80s.
Yeah.
And then, of course, with LGBTQ characters, there was a lot of that too. Sam Weinman, another one of the great talking heads in this, he makes the point, context. It's like, you shouldn't cancel these movies because they came out 30 years ago. You should understand where these movies came from.
Yeah.
And, a lot of it was, you saw in the early 80s, a lot of the, there were a lot of gay characters, but then when AIDS came out, not like AIDS is a movie, when AIDS became more publicized, they had to kind of pull back on that. And so things got a lot more stereotypical. A movie that was mentioned that we talked about that's on Shudder now is Fear No Evil, where there's this really weird, erotic, gay shower scene.
Yeah.
And like, it came out in 81. And like, I feel like if that movie would have tried to come out in 84, 85, they would have cut that.
Yes.
And, a movie that was talked about before in the previous In Search of Darkness movies, of course, is Nightmare on Elm Street 2. There's a whole documentary about Mark Patton on Shudder, Scream Queen, which is fantastic. That's something we could probably look into covering as well. Right. But yeah, I just love like how meticulous David Weiner gets with these chapter breakdowns, and it, really covering all the bases. And again, it really makes it feel more topical because we're still talking about tropes in horror movies. I'll never forget the movie Underwater with Kristen Stewart. Came out I don't know if you saw it. Came out and I really enjoyed it. And I'll never forget going on Twitter afterwards, and it didn't occur to me watching it.
Yeah.
But it occurred to me after on Twitter when basically every black horror critic I saw was like, wow, still doing it, huh? Fuck that movie. And I was like, what the hell are they? And it occurs to me that there's one black character in the movie, and his character is the one who, like 10 minutes into the movie, there's a problem with his mask and he dies right away. And I'm like, wow, okay. So that's why, like, so that trope is still kind of going on. Yeah. And, there are, issues with representation today. I mean, you see that with Oscar nominations, Oscar's so white and all these things. So I think it's really awesome that David brings these things up, focusing on, obviously 80s horror, but they're still prevalent today.
Yeah. And I mean, a great example of that too is how, we often talk about how female directors often get maligned, right? Like they don't get as much credit, or people don't give their work as much credit as it deserves. And in that sequence, that sequence is really well done because it talks about the filmmaker, and then it has like all their movies as VHS tapes, right? And you look at them, and at the very end, they had Catherine Bigelow, and they had one other female director too in that sequence.
Yeah.
And I think that Catherine Bigelow is great to mention because, I mean, she has Near Dark in her filmography, and then I think she's just an incredible director besides that. But yeah, I mean, David did a great job of talking about, all different groups, but I like that he also championed women throughout the movie too. There were these two sequences where he has like Adrienne Barbeau in the very beginning, and then Dee Wallace, right? Or Dee Wallace Stone, I think she is now. But
no, she was Dee Wallace Stone. Her and Christopher Stone divorced.
Okay.
That was a really funny part of the documentary. She talks about how when they were making The Howling together, like he has this super like nude scene with this gorgeous other werewolf woman, and then a few years later she was doing a nude scene in the movie and he was like flipping out about it. Right. She really like threw some shade at like, how come it's okay for you but not for me?
Right. And that's, once again, we talk about patterns and stuff. There is a double standard, and it's highlighted throughout the movie where they talk about, what female actors are able to do. And they also talk about, like, there's a couple of times where some of the talking heads are actresses that are in these movies. And they talk about how, like, when we would audition, we would have to kind of show our breasts or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I remember. Yeah, there was one movie where I forgot the specific person, but yeah, where...
But what's so cool about this movie is that, like, you'll then highlight something like Slumber Party Massacre 2, and that has a female director, right?
Yep.
And so, like,
and the greatest killer of all time.
Right. But so, David just does this great job of making sure that, like, everyone is represented in this documentary. And I just wanted to just point out, like, maybe one or two more highlights before I get into my last pick. But I actually really liked Kathleen. How do you say her last name? Wilhoit? Will, who she's in Witchboard. And then
oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. I didn't write her name down, but she like screams 80s for me. She has like that raspy voice that I always like. I want her to be like my best friend.
Well, I kind of feel like she reminds me of Cyndi Lauper, and she just kind of reminds me of like my aunt or something, or like, women I knew when I was a little kid growing up in Staten Island. She just kind of seems like she's that kind of person. So my last thing I wanted to bring up before my final pick is that there are movies in this documentary that are like classic horror movies that they just never mentioned before, like Critters, right? Or like The Hitcher. And some of these are movies that I've seen Critters. I've seen Critters multiple times, a lot when I was a little kid. But there's some movies that are in this list that are like obvious horror movies, and I just haven't seen them, like The Gate and The Hitcher, the original one. I think I saw a bit of the remake of The Hitcher with like Sean Bean, but obviously I didn't see the Rutger Hauer one, which is like so good. And so like it just kind of makes you want to just watch some of these classics, especially The Gate, after they talked about it. And one thing I forgot to mention too was that you mentioned Fear No Evil, and that's directed by Frank LaLoggia, right? And they have two of his movies in there. They also have Lady in White. And that also looked like a movie that had like amazing cinematography. And I just want to check that out too. Have you seen that one?
That is a movie that I've legit not seen in 35 years. That was one of the first movies that I remember my dad renting for me. Probably, when did that come out? 88, I think. 89, maybe. So like, okay, maybe I was 7 years old and my dad rented it for me. And I remember getting a little scared of this like weird ghost movie. But that was like one of those first like gateway horror movies that I remember seeing. And speaking of gateway horror, The Gate was one of the first horror movies I showed to Charlotte, probably when she was like 7 years old, because it's more fun than it is scary.
Right, exactly.
So do you want to get to your number one or what the movie you have left on your list?
Yeah, because we got about like 5 minutes left if we're going to do an hour. So I got for my last one, and it's not even that exciting, but it's The Video Dead. I've never seen it. I think it has like this great cover if you look at the VHS of it. But It stars Michael St. Michael's, the Greasy Strangler, and it just looked like a lot of fun. I was intrigued by it. What about you, man?
Uh, as far as that goes, I thought it was fun getting to see Michael St. Michael's talk, knowing that I've seen the Greasy Strangler and going, oh, so he's not such a weird guy. Okay, that's good to know.
Right.
Yeah, no, Video Dead sounds fun. My last one, and I want to throw out as a couple honorable mentions. The last horror film I think looks amazing. I love Joe Spinell so much. This is a
Yeah.
guy who was in The Godfather. This is a guy who was in Rocky, and then, by the way, went off and did Maniac and the last horror film. And I love the guerrilla feel to it. How like they're legit running through the Cannes Film Festival
Yes.
while
Yes.
it's going on.
Yeah.
And like the director was like, no, Carolyn Monroe, go, run.
Right.
She was like, okay, I'm in a towel.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk about that movie a little bit more. Santa Sangre is a movie that is made by Jodorowsky, who is a director whose entire filmography I have missed. El Topo, The Holy Mountain, is a guy who, is a total blind spot to me that I desperately need to catch up on. But my number one, and it's a real cheesy one, but it's Puppet Master, because this is a movie that like randomly came out in the mid 80s. It was such a video hit. It's made by Full Moon, that is still around today. Charlie Band, who's somebody that Joe Bob talks about all the time. One of those like almost Lloyd Kaufman-esque, real, like built it from the ground up, low budget horror guys. And it's a franchise that somehow is up to like movie 15,
Right.
and they're still releasing them today. So I am in no way saying we should cover all the Puppet Master movies,
no.
but I remember like renting parts 1 through 5, like almost like together, and doing like, that was like one of the first times I ever remember doing like a marathon for myself.
Right.
Was renting Puppet Masters 1, 2, and 3. And then I remember 4 and 5 came out. And then after that, I just kind of stopped. But yeah, I was probably like 7 or 8. And like evil puppets, like that's awesome. And,
yes.
So yeah, that was the movie I chose to be like the last one on my list.
Yeah, that's a good choice. And that's actually one of those classic horror movies that everyone has seen that I haven't. So I would gladly talk about that with you too.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we come in, we wrap up our hour together. I just want to remind you guys at home that like these are mine and Danny's suggestions. But if you guys are like, hey, what about this movie? Like, we want to make sure that you're included in this too. So we want to come up with a nice top 10. We've already done Possession, which was fucking awesome. You can check out that video on the channel. Coming up this week on the Lastercast 2 is going to be part 2 of our top 10 of 2023 list. Our numbers 5 through 1. So I think that number, the first video that has 10 through 6 came out pretty well. I'm real excited about our top 5. So
yeah,
what else you got on our channel, my man?
I mean, I'm gonna post a video about Unmasked Part 25.
Nice.
It might be a short. It might be a little more in depth. But I love the movie. It's Valentine's Day coming up. It's a perfect movie for Valentine's Day. Shudder has the remake of My Bloody Valentine up, and it's one of the better 80s horror remakes. I think it's a movie that a lot of people probably saw like its opening weekend and then completely forgot about. So if you want to go check that out, it's on Shudder. And I was thinking about rewatching that this week, as well as the original, which is one of my all-time favorite horror films, the original My Bloody Valentine. So yeah, maybe some Valentine's Day horror this week. But yeah, I can't wait for our 5 to 1 best of 2022, because I thought we had some really good picks there. And yeah, this has been great. I can't wait to talk more about the movies that we mentioned here.
Ah, perfect. Look at this. This guy got it right under an hour. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching with us. And let us know your picks. And we will see you guys